Let me say my formal hello, good early morning to our friends in North and South America. Good afternoon to our friends in the UK, in Europe, in the Arab states. Good early evening to our friends in India. Good evening to our friends in Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia. Good late evening to our friends in Australia. Nice to see you all. Hope you are well. JC, we have some questions, I believe.
Yes, Prajan, we do. Question 1, Prajan. After around 30 years of mantra meditation and several Buddhist meditation retreats, I am now following your Insight Timer offerings. Could you please offer guidance about a sequence of choices, direction of choice? Thank you.
Yeah. Insight Timer is a it's a wonderful thing, but it's also, like all conditions, not a perfect thing. Insight Timer doesn't really allow the teachers to arrange or collate the material, present them in a particular way. They're presented according to the date that they were uploaded or according to how many views they've received. So in terms of working with the material that I've produced and presented, I don't recommend Insight Timer as the perfect medium for that. I have a website and Peace Beyond Suffering website where teachings have been presented in collections. I think there's 9 collections. And basically, if you essentially scroll from the beginning to the end, that would make more sense. The body sweeping and breath practices are presented first. That's to just get a sense of establishing presence of mind in the body, being able to be with the breath for a while before one takes on contemplative or reflective meditations. And then the next collection, I believe, would be the metta, the loving kindness practice, which I think is for modern people really essential, that we establish a healthy sense of self-care, self-interest, make sure that we come to our spiritual practice with a good attitude. Actually, we are desiring to have less suffering. We're wishing ourselves well as others. And once we have this, a lot of people have self-aversion, self-hatred, self-loathing, a withholding of loving kindness towards themselves. And that can be, I wouldn't really recommend picking up the body contemplation or the death meditations if you've got a lot of self-aversion, because you can kind of start hacking apart the body or imagining gruesome ways of dying. And if you're not coming from the right space, that might not be helpful yet. So you have to get in touch with the fact that you're recognizing your enlightenment potential. You're recognizing that ultimately the mind is a wonderful thing that can be purified, liberated, enlightened. And so we want to rejoice in that potential, cultivate that potential, affirm that potential, have a healthy sense of self-care, self-interest. And this usually goes in conjunction with keeping ethical precepts and being generous so that you like yourself, so that you don't have things to feel remorse about, so that you make good karma. Then we pick up the death contemplation. One of the main reasons we do the death contemplation in the beginning stages is because it gives rise to a sense of urgency and it helps us to focus. We stop taking for granted that we stop assuming that we'll live to be 80 or 90 and acknowledge the fact that we could die today or much sooner than we thought. This will help us to have the right kind of priorities in our life. So once you've got your breath meditation, your loving kindness, your awareness of impermanence, then it's time to do the more active contemplations of not self, investigation of body parts, investigation of body parts as being elements, and things like the charnel ground practice, and imagining the body dying and being scattered, and all that's left being dust, which is blown away in the wind. Nothing left eventually of the body, but of the awareness that meditates on impermanence. That awareness becomes purified. And then I presented, the later collections are largely teachings from retreats. So there'll be sutta talks about the cardinal suttas, Dhammacakka Sutta, Sutra on Not Self, the Fire Sermon, and wonderful to consider those, the Anapanasati Sutta. And one of the later collections is the collection on compassion, where one is trying to develop a broad and boundless, all-inclusive attitude of compassion as advanced practice. So yes, I recommend that people have a look at the website. And some items might not seem relevant, or they might seem too basic, and you can skip over it if you like. But the thing about the basic practices of Buddhism is that you can never really say something's too basic. If something is to help you generate more clarity, more presence of mind, it's not like you did that already. You have to ask yourself, how's my presence of mind? How's my clarity? Sometimes we have to go back to the basics. And it's always, in every meditation at the very beginning, it's like starting again. Establishing the mindfulness of the breath, establishing the presence of mind. How present are you? If the mind's very scattered, it might be good to do a body sweeping first. And it might be helpful if there's a lot of thinking to count the breath. It seems like a really basic meditation. However, if you are just sitting there thinking, or sitting there and falling asleep, counting the breath can help you to be more mindful. So good to review those things. In general, once we've got a basic practice, Lord Buddha recommends, if you are aversive, lose your patience quickly, get angry quickly, hold on to grudges, then we need to make loving kindness like a large part of our practice. If we're very greedy and very sensual, then we actually have to make body contemplation more of a focus of our practice, in terms of weakening the kilesas that cloud the mind and obstruct it from seeing things clearly. So, I hope that's helpful.
Prajan, question 2. Longing for the deathless, I find a relative lack of interest in the focus on the breath. The breath is the symbol of our perishable embodied experience. What do you recommend?
So I can kind of see where this person is coming from with this statement, but I don't believe it's true or correct. In as much as when consciousness leaves this body at the end of this life, the breath will stop in this body. So that's true. That's true with regards to that one moment. It's not true to say that the breath is a symbol of the perishable nature of the body, because the breath has the same nature as everything else. So every breath has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's exactly the same with a thought, and that's exactly the same with a feeling. It's exactly the same with any kind of contemplation, and it's exactly the same with any kind of meditation absorption. Even a meditation absorption is going to have its beginning, its middle, and its end. So the world of conditions is the realm of death. That means that everything, your form body is subject to death, the feelings are subject to death, the thoughts are subject to death, the types of consciousness are subject to death. So the whole thing is perishable. The whole thing is flux. What I recommend is reading the paragraph in the introduction to the Anapanasati Sutta, Ana, in breath, Pana, out breath, Sati, mindfulness of in and out breathing, where Lord Buddha mentions the potential of the practice. He says, if I remember correctly, I'll paraphrase, he says, in cultivating breath meditation, in practicing breath meditation, the four foundations of mindfulness are cultivated. In the process of cultivating the four foundations of mindfulness, the 7 factors of enlightenment are brought to fulfillment. In bringing the 7 factors of enlightenment to fulfillment, the mind is liberated. One paragraph in the introduction of the Anapanasati Sutta, this practice, when undertook correctly, leads to enlightenment. So it's one of my favorite suttas, one of my favorite paragraphs in the Sutta Pitaka, because it's so, it's just a statement of incredible potential of the practice and of the mind of the practitioner. So then, how do we relate to the breath, that we see it as the amazing meditation object that it is? So that's a different question. That's a question I had, an interesting question. How do I relate to the breath? Because Lord Buddha says breath meditation in another sutta, he says, is the crown jewel in all of the meditations. It's the crown jewel in the crown of meditation objects. It's quite a statement. So I think doing a bit of recollection about that, Lord Buddha says this is really special. And Lord Buddha was pretty amazing, the wisest, most compassionate, all-knowing being who was also a non-being. And so yes, that's interesting. So if we come to meditation and the breath is a bit dull, there's other things impinging on the breath. There's the thoughts, there's the feelings, there's the thoughts about parts of each other, people, other places, pain. And then the breath isn't going to be very special. What we have to do is, just as I was leading in the guided meditation earlier, is we give interest, we give care, we continue to give the attention to the knowing the feelings as they change moment by moment. And what happens is, as the breath becomes more subtle, the awareness has to attenuate and become more subtle to notice it. This is the thing about not allowing the mind to fall into sleep. We notice the more subtle breath, and we incline the mind to becoming more subtle. It has to become more kind of still. It has to do less to notice that, notice the change moment by moment. And then it takes an effort to not fall asleep. The thing about the breath, technically, when talking about the 4 foundations of mindfulness, it counts as awareness of the body, kaya gata nusati, because it's occurring. There's a phrase, often people take shortcuts, and it's not completely truthful when we talk about physical feelings. There isn't really such a thing as a physical feeling. All feelings are occurring in consciousness, and all consciousness is mental. But it is a feeling that arises due to body-based contact. That's how it's described in the suttas. A feeling that arises due to body-based contact. So the body is breathing. But the feelings occurring in consciousness, mind consciousness. And so what's very interesting about that is, as the breath begins to get more subtle, you should notice that it's less of a feeling of the lungs expanding or the abdomen expanding. It starts to become, for myself, it becomes a bit more kind of like a globe of feeling that just expands and contracts. It's kind of spherical or round. It doesn't really feel like a nose, a chest, or an abdomen. It's just a sense of expansion and contraction. And if we might maintain our mindfulness on the breathing consistently as we're instructed, simply knowing when it's short, knowing when it's long, which means knowing it as it is in the moment, then the breath becomes sometimes called the beautiful breath. It's when the mind starts to experience qualities of rapture, tranquility, serenity, because it's being consistently mindful of the breath, then the breath is obviously more interesting. But to get these results requires a consistent practice. Many people, the challenge of most people is that they're not doing enough of it. So if you're doing a breath meditation for 20 minutes or half an hour before going to sleep, and you've had a very, very busy day, it's probably not going to be a beautiful breath. It's going to be a sleepy, heavy breath, which is being invaded by heavy sleepiness. And if you have a very, very busy life, you come to sit, and there's going to be a lot of thinking. So your thoughts are taking you away from the awareness of the breath. And once again, the breath isn't going to be a beautiful breath. But if you make time, do a couple of sessions a day, and it's good to just do a bit of reflection, like what I was saying, what it says in the Anapanasati Sutta, what the Buddha says about this practice is really special. So, okay, so embrace it with an attitude of respect, reverence. This is my meditation object. This is my vehicle to enlightenment. If I undertake this correctly, this will help me fulfill the 4 foundations of mindfulness and the 7 factors of enlightenment. So you just do a bit of a positive affirmation and recollection. Okay, make it special. Remind yourself, it's full of potential. How does it help you cultivate the 4 foundations of mindfulness? So what happens is you're sitting there and you're trying to be aware of the breath, and you become aware of your back pain. And you become aware of your knee pain. So it's like right there's awareness of feelings. You're trying to be aware of the feelings of the breath, but you're aware of other feelings. And as you're noticing the breath arising, staying for some time and ceasing, then you will also notice these other feelings are all changing, throbbing, swirling, etc. And then there'll be the thoughts. Here I am trying to be with my breath, as that's all. That woman at work, she's such a blah, 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 and she did it again, and blah, 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 and my boss, he's such an, whatever. We all have the frequent flyers, those thoughts that will come, my ex-husband, blah, blah, blah. And so it's like, so you're trying to be aware of the breath, there's thoughts. Back to the breath. But if you're cultivating some clarity, you'll notice that, one thought arises, it stimulates the next thought. The first thought might be about the child. Then it's about angry at the ex-husband who didn't discipline the child. Whatever, it'll spin out. He shouldn't have done that. He should have honored our vows, or whatever it is. The whole samsaric story that we all have. But if we keep coming back to the breath, you're becoming aware the body is a body, which has feelings that arise, take some time to change, thoughts, mind objects that arise and fall, and we train ourselves to know this, notice the changing, notice the arising, notice the ceasing, especially the cessation. And what happens is if you can notice the changing and then the cessation of a feeling, the changing and the cessation of a breath, the cessation of a thought, and you begin to notice these spaces. And what happens is this lovely sense of spacious awareness begins to kind of pervade things, so that the spacious awareness for skilled meditators becomes more prominent than the things that impinge upon it. And the breath is becoming more subtle, and the awareness is becoming more vast and more present, and things arise and cease within this beautiful, clear awareness, and the insight begins to develop about the nature of these things. Now, of course, as one progresses in breath meditation even further, what happens is the breath will become more and more subtle, and the meditator may perceive it that the breath stops. And actually the breath doesn't stop. What happens is the breath becomes more and more subtle, and what's happening is the mind is taking peacefulness as its object and turning inwards. and it will take peacefulness as its object, and it can't feel the breath anymore. How it's experienced is I've stopped breathing. Very important not to panic then, because it's a really good sign. The mind is gathering, collecting, turning inwards. Would normally feel bright, light, peaceful, very rapturous. And if you can just stay still, allow the mind to be still. After a period of time, the breath will come back. And the breath will be kind of permeated with feelings of rapture, tranquility, serenity. It becomes a very beautiful thing. It becomes this thing that leads you into peaceful mind states, bright mind states. It becomes this thing that helps you put down all of the other objects because you're picking up this object. And it becomes the kind of eye in the storm that allows you to see arising and ceasing, arising and ceasing, and developing insight. Also, as the mind becomes more subtle when it's in states of what they call upachara samadhi, which means touching on jhana or almost in jhana, some people will have visions of beings in parallel realms. I'm not saying that's something that anyone should aim for, but I'm just saying it's quite common. That if a person's mind becomes peaceful, still, subtle, not quite absorbed, but on the verge of absorbing, that's the state where the great monks see the nagas or the devas visiting from heaven. And so the breath can lead to really illustrious, beautiful states, and can be the foundation for how we develop insight. But we do have to invest quite a bit into it. So one has to care for it, one has to love it, one has to have confidence in it, one has to give it time and attention. It's like if it was a seed, you have to water it, you have to allow the sun to shine on it, you have to nourish it with consistent care. And probably one of the biggest challenges I think most meditators have is they don't quite do enough. And then they also have periods where they neglect the practice. And there's that sense of taking one step forward, one step back, not really getting anywhere. If we want to get somewhere in our practices, then we have to do it every day. We have to be really determined not to have days where we don't do it unless we're sick or traveling, occasional, genuine, valid reasons. It just becomes something that one has to do. One does do it because it's your vehicle to liberation. So I have great faith in the value of anapanasati. It's the foundation of my practice. I love the beautiful breath. And once one trains in picking up the breath, the way I teach reflective meditations is when one does contemplation of death or contemplation of body parts, or loving kindness, I always teach these things in conjunction with the breathing, so that just this being aware of the breath becomes it's like the walking stick, the thing that keeps you upright, that keeps the mind upright, just always checking in with in and out breath. If it's metta, breathing in, may I be well. Breathing out, may all beings be well. Breathing in, may I be happy. Breathing out, may all beings be happy. Breathing in, mindful of death, marana. Breathing out, mindful of death, marana. And in my experience now, practicing this for 26, 27 years, in my ordinary life, if I'm not talking, someone else is talking, I'm listening to them, I'm just automatically aware of my in and out breathing. That's just, I wake up in the morning, tend to be aware of the breath. And because if you do it morning, afternoon, evening, every day, it just becomes something the mind is attenuated to resting with. And yes, I encourage you, your breath meditation. Hope it leads you to beautiful, radiant, serene, tranquil, rapturous mind states and beyond.
Thank you so much, Prajan. Question 3. Dear Ajahn, what is the right attitude towards thoughts, and what are wholesome thoughts? Someone told me that wholesome thoughts are thoughts about non-self, thoughts free from greed, hatred, and delusion. If there's no self, that means there will be no thinking. hence wholesome thoughts wouldn't really exist. Is this correct?
Yes and no. So, wholesome thoughts about generosity, thoughts about kindness, thoughts about helping others, altruistic thoughts of generosity, thoughts of virtue, thoughts of, I think Lord Buddha says, thoughts of non-cruelty, thoughts of loving kindness. So there are wholesome thoughts. And I would say meditation objects, a directed, focused contemplation is a wholesome thought. And then there are unwholesome thoughts. So then it's good to review occasionally the list of the 16 upakilesa, the main negative qualities that invade the mind. Thoughts of greed, competitiveness, so pride, stubbornness, all of these things, sensuality. So it's good to train in knowing wholesome thoughts as wholesome thoughts and neutral thoughts as neutral thoughts, unwholesome thoughts as unwholesome thoughts. To say that if there's no self ultimately, then there's no such thing as a wholesome thought. So not self, the teaching on not self does not say that there is no self. So Lord Buddha talks about conventional and ultimate reality. And, people get hung up on this. I kind of understood it as a concept fairly early, so I sometimes feel challenged in, I don't quite understand why other people don't understand it sometimes. I mean, just if you read any sutta, it usually starts with when the courteous and amiable speech was over. Basically, the Buddha was saying, hi, yeah, how are the crops? How's the family? What was the weather like where you came from or whatever? He's functioning as a nice guy who knows how to be polite and gracious. And then he will teach that person in a way that's helpful to them. So Lord Buddha obviously realized not self. He didn't not have any more thoughts. He didn't become incapable of talking. He didn't become incapable of relating. He became a master of relationship. He knew how to relate to everybody perfectly, to meet them where they were and lead them somewhere better. So put some thought into this, and please consider that there is a conventional reality and there is an ultimate reality. And people who realize ultimate reality tend to relate to conventional reality better than deluded beings. Because they know how to relate to it wisely, skillfully. Understanding what is conventional reality and understanding what is ultimate reality. People think they are selves. There is seeing the self-view as a self-view means they see it as a view. And they know how to work with it. They know how to use it. They don't believe it's ultimate truth. Now, to say if there's no self, then there's no thoughts. Now, if the Arahant is absorbed in Nibbana, this is where I said it's partially a correct statement. Because if the Arahant is absorbed in his or her realization of Nibbana, there's no thoughts. In the mind that's abiding in the realization of not-self, in the unconditioned, yes, there's no thoughts there. And there's no self there. But when the Arahant comes out of the contemplation of, comes out of the abiding in Nibbana, then the Nibbana is there and the five khandhas are there, and the Arahant knows how to relate to it. So it's a very interesting occasion where Sariputta was meditating on voidness, and the sky was full of Brahmadevas. Brahmadevas being the most radiant beings in samsara, and then they went to see the Buddha afterwards, and they said, we were just admiring the radiance of Sariputta's mind as he was meditating. We don't know what he was meditating on, but it was so luminous and so bright and so beautiful. We were rejoicing in it and paying respects. And they made the statement, and we know whence not from which this radiance shone forth, because the Brahmadevas hadn't realized arahantship. They're not aware of Nibbana. But to their refined minds, they can see that Sariputta's mind, when he's meditating on Nibbana, was the brightest phenomenon they could see. And these beings who rejoice in brightness have very bright minds, brightness based on concentration. But Sariputta's brightness was based upon concentration and purification, no greed, hatred, or delusion present in experience. And in that experience, Sariputta couldn't have a conversation with the Brahmadevas. He was absorbed in his realization of Nibbana. And same with the Buddha. But the Brahmadevas could go and have a conversation with the Buddha afterwards. So, yes, there is conventional and ultimate reality. May we all navigate conventional reality skillfully, and may we all realize ultimate reality. Because it is superior state-wise, one experiences unshakable peace and fearlessness with the realization of Nibbana.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
It's very good to contemplate Nibbana sometimes. Obviously, it's a subtle contemplation. People don't have experience of it. But to consider that when greed, hatred, and ignorance isn't there anymore, something is. A purified mind is there. And it's experiences unshakable peace. It doesn't perceive itself as a self, but it's not, Lord Buddha says his teaching is not nihilism. So something, it's not spiritual suicide. You don't kill the self-view and get to abide in. There's various subjects interesting to contemplate. Emptiness is not nothingness. Not self doesn't mean there is no self. These are interesting things. That's it for our questions, JC. 3 questions tonight.
Yes, Ajahn, that is the last question for today. Okay. Thank you so much.
A few people have made a contribution to an Anandagiri monastery recently. I want to offer my anumodana and thank you. I had a type of challenge similar to that of many lay people. Abbots sometimes have to juggle many hats, talking about conventional realities. We have a building project in the era of inflation, where the budget, which looked like it was going to be enough 6 months ago, wasn't. And with wages and deliveries and with building products going up, then I was looking at the accounting books and realizing, uh-oh. But some people have rallied to help us. We did have about 85% of what we needed. Some people have helped enough so to be able to pay the bills next month in cooperation with the committee, monastery committee. Thank you, Sadhu. I think many people are experiencing that. My friend Ajahn Sudanto in the Pacific Northwest had a similar challenge, and Ajahn Viradama had a similar challenge in Canada. And then we have the big question, should we just stop, wait? And then it's like, well, things are going to be more expensive next year. So it's probably best to try and get it finished if you can. And, conditioned reality always has some challenges, doesn't it? How do they say? What do they say in England? If it's not one thing, it's another.
Sadhu, sadhu.
Ra.
Thank you, Ajahn.
Nice to see you. Nice to see you all. Look forward to seeing you next
Nice.
time.
Thank you.
Sadhu, salam.
Sadhu.
Ajahn.
Bye.
Ajahn.
Good night.